They audited my desk while I was at lunch. A simple 30-minute break was all it took for years of quiet loyalty to turn into public humiliation. When I came back, 3 compliance officers were standing at my workstation, my drawers open, files scattered like debris after a storm. The whole floor had gone silent, the kind of silence that hums with judgment and curiosity. My manager, Greg, leaned against the cubicle wall with that smug little grin of his, arms folded, watching the scene unfold like he'd been waiting for it. He didn't say a word, he didn't have to. The message was clear, I was being set up. For years, I had been the invisible backbone of that company, a senior analyst who knew every system, every account, every hidden inconsistency the rest of them were too lazy to understand. I'd trained half the department, fixed problems the executives couldn't even identify, and never once complained about the long nights or broken weekends. But when new management arrived, everything changed. Greg was one of them, a corporate climber in shiny shoes and empty confidence. He didn't like people who made him look stupid, and I'd done that more than once, without even trying. When I asked what was happening, one of the compliance officers looked up and said, "Routine audit." But the way he said it, tight, rehearsed, told me it was anything but routine. They'd found a folder on my desk, one I didn't recognize, filled with old invoices, spreadsheets, and what looked like forged approvals tied to my name. Greg stepped forward then, pretending to be surprised, and said, "We'll need to suspend you pending investigation." Just like that, 15 years of spotless service went up in smoke. I was escorted out, humiliated in front of everyone I'd mentored. I didn't say a word as I walked through those glass doors for what I thought would be the last time. But inside, I made a promise. I wasn't going to fight them in HR meetings or email threads. No, I'd take my revenge where it hurt the most, in the numbers they worshipped. You see, Greg and his little clique had made one fatal mistake. They underestimated how much I knew. They'd assumed that because I was quiet, I was harmless. They forgot who built the very systems they used to manipulate the books. I'd created the audit tracker, the financial reporting templates, even the back-end permissions for access logs. Everything they touched, every fake number they pushed through, left a trail I could follow. And while they thought they'd buried me, I spent my suspension at home digging through archived files and local backups, because I had copies of everything. Every report, every timestamp, every forged entry Greg had made to inflate quarterly profits. When the company called me in for a disciplinary hearing 2 weeks later, I showed up calm, carrying a simple black folder. Inside it was the truth, clean, undeniable, timestamped truth. They started the meeting with their usual rehearsed lines about violations of trust, but I interrupted halfway through. "Before you continue," I said, sliding the folder across the table, "you might want to check your data sources." Their faces changed as they flipped through the evidence, Greg's login credentials tied to unauthorized edits, transactions rerouted through dummy accounts, false approvals under his initials. I watched the color drain from his face as realization hit. The audit that had been meant to bury me had instead become his grave. 2 weeks later, Greg was gone. Officially, it was for personal reasons, but everyone knew the truth. The compliance team conducted a full-scale internal review, and the board personally called to apologize for the misunderstanding. But I wasn't interested in apologies. I'd already moved on to something bigger. I used that entire experience as fuel. Within a few months, I'd launched my own consultancy specializing in forensic audits, helping other employees and small firms uncover financial manipulation and corruption within their organizations. The same skills that Greg and his team tried to use against me became the foundation of my independence. Ironically, the company I'd once slaved for became one of my first clients, brought in to investigate irregularities left behind after Greg's departure. Walking back into that building, this time as a paid consultant, was poetic. The same executives who once avoided eye contact now greeted me with forced smiles and weak handshakes. And as I passed my old desk, now occupied by someone new, I paused for a moment, not out of nostalgia, but to remind myself how quickly things can change when the quiet ones stop playing nice. Because that's the thing about revenge, it's not always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, patient, and perfectly calculated. They audited my desk while I was at lunch, thinking they'd find my downfall. What they found instead was their own corruption, neatly documented by the man they tried to destroy. In the end, they lost their jobs, their reputations, and their confidence. And I walked away with peace, proof, and the satisfying knowledge that sometimes, karma doesn't wait for fate, it waits for you to sharpen your own pen. After that audit fiasco, word spread quickly throughout the company. People whispered my name in the halls, not as the guy who'd been caught, but as the one who'd quietly turned the tables. Greg's downfall became a kind of office legend, a cautionary tale wrapped in corporate gossip. But for me, it wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming my dignity, piece by piece, after years of being treated like background noise in a company I helped build from the ground up. A few months after Greg's firing, I received an unexpected call from the CFO. She wanted me to come back, not as an employee, but as an external advisor to help rebuild the company's internal controls. It was almost laughable. The same board that had thrown me out was now willing to pay triple my old salary to clean up the mess they'd ignored for years. I agreed, but not out of loyalty, out of curiosity. I wanted to see what had become of the place once the rot was exposed. When I walked through those glass doors again, it felt different. The energy had shifted. People who once avoided me now greeted me with respect. The new hires didn't even know the story, they just saw me as the expert consultant. Still, the older employees, those who had watched my humiliation, gave me subtle nods of recognition. They knew what I'd done. They knew who'd really won. In the following weeks, I uncovered more than even I had expected. Greg's corruption was only part of the story. There were bonuses routed through shell vendors, procurement deals manipulated for kickbacks, even executive signatures on falsified performance metrics. The deeper I dug, the uglier it got. But instead of leaking it or using it for vengeance, I did something different this time. I documented everything and presented it cleanly to the board. No drama. No emotion. Just facts. Cold, undeniable facts. When I finished, the CFO leaned back in her chair, stunned. "You could have buried us," she said quietly. "Why didn't you?" I smiled faintly. "Because I'm not like the people who tried to bury me." That night, as I left the office, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. Real, steady peace. The kind that doesn't come from winning, but from walking away knowing you've already won. A year later, my consultancy had grown into a full firm, one that specialized in protecting employees and small businesses from corporate manipulation. We called it Audit Shield. Every client we helped, every fraud we uncovered, every unfairly accused worker we cleared, it all felt like quiet justice. I hired people who'd been through the same things I had: the overlooked, the betrayed, the falsely blamed. Together, we turned pain into precision. Sometimes, late at night, I'd think about that day, the audit, the humiliation, the whispers. How a simple lunch break had flipped my entire career upside down. But now, looking back, I realize it wasn't the worst day of my life. It was the day everything began to make sense. Because without that betrayal, I never would have built Audit Shield. I never would have found my voice or my purpose. And I never would have understood that revenge doesn't always mean destroying your enemies. It can mean outlasting them, outgrowing them, and building something so strong they can never touch it again. A few years later, I got an anonymous email with a simple message: "Greg's been blacklisted. No one will hire him again. Thought you'd like to know." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. I just closed my laptop, looked around my office, and smiled. Because in the end, they audited my desk looking for weakness. What they found was the beginning of their own unraveling. And the sweetest part? I didn't just get even. I got better. Months after that final audit, the company completely restructured. Half of the executives resigned for personal reasons, and the board quietly announced a culture transformation initiative. Corporate speak for, we messed up, badly. I watched it all unfold from the outside, sipping my morning coffee while reading articles about their new direction. The irony? They were now implementing the same transparency and ethics protocols I had proposed years ago, proposals that Greg and his allies had mocked and buried. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. Success has a way of speaking louder than revenge ever could. My consulting firm, Audit Shield, started landing major contracts, including government and tech clients. The very same Fortune 500 company that fired me was now sending their new hires to my workshops. They were paying me to teach integrity. If that isn't poetic justice, I don't know what is. But life has a funny way of circling back. One afternoon, as I was preparing for a keynote at a business ethics conference, I got a call from a familiar voice. It was the HR director from my old company. She said Greg had reached out, begging for a reference, hoping I'd vouch for him to help rebuild his career. I let her finish before answering. I don't think my reference would help him much. She laughed softly and hung up. That was the last I ever heard of Greg. A few years later, Audit Shield grew into something far beyond what I had imagined. We had offices in 3 cities, a staff of 50, and a waiting list of clients. But more than that, we built a culture that valued truth and fairness, the exact opposite of what I'd endured. Every time I saw a young analyst stand up for themselves or uncover fraud without fear of retaliation, I felt proud. Because I knew what it felt like to be silenced. And I made sure no one who worked for me would ever feel that way. One evening, after wrapping up a long day, I stopped by the old building where it all began. It had been sold, repainted, rebranded under a new name. But I still recognized the glass lobby, the cold marble floors, the faint hum of fluorescent lights. For a moment, I stood there, remembering that version of myself, the quiet worker who once believed loyalty was enough to protect him. I smiled. That man was gone. In his place stood someone sharper, wiser, unbreakable. I turned to leave, but before I did, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the glass, older now, a few more lines around my eyes, but calm. Satisfied. Behind that reflection wasn't an ex-employee. It was a survivor who'd rewritten his own story. As I walked away, I thought about the phrase that had haunted me after that audit. What they found shocked everyone. At the time, I thought it referred to Greg's fraud. But now I realize, what truly shocked them wasn't what was in my desk. It was me. My resilience. My refusal to stay down. Because they thought they were auditing a man they could break. What they actually uncovered was someone who could rebuild, smarter, stronger, and untouchable. And that's the real ending to the story. Not the downfall, not the revenge, but the rebirth. They thought they'd ended my career when they opened that desk drawer. But what they really did was open the first chapter of my empire. Years passed, and Audit Shield became more than a consulting firm, it became a movement. Companies that once ignored ethics now came to us out of necessity. We exposed corruption quietly, efficiently, and without theatrics. Word spread fast. If Audit Shield was investigating you, it was already too late. We built our reputation on truth, not revenge, but deep down, every success felt like a quiet victory against the people who once underestimated me. Then, one day, an unexpected opportunity arrived in my inbox. It was an invitation to deliver a keynote speech at an international corporate governance summit. The theme? Integrity in modern business. The irony wasn't lost on me. Years ago, I'd been humiliated for doing the right thing. Now, I was being honored for it. As I walked onto that massive stage, the lights blinding and the crowd stretching endlessly before me, I spotted a few familiar faces among the audience, board members from my old company. They tried to hide behind polite smiles, but I could see it, the recognition, the disbelief, and maybe a hint of regret. I began my speech not with numbers or business jargon, but with a story. My story. I told them about the audit, the betrayal, the desk search. I told them about how they tried to find dirt on me but found corruption among their own instead. And then I told them about Audit Shield, how it was built from the ashes of that day, forged from humiliation into something incorruptible. By the time I finished, the room was silent. No applause at first, just quiet realization. Then, slowly, the clapping began. It grew louder, stronger, until the entire hall stood on its feet. Afterward, a reporter approached me backstage. "That was powerful," she said. "You really turned your story into something bigger." I smiled, adjusting my tie. "Revenge doesn't have to destroy someone," I said. "Sometimes it just means proving them wrong by living better." A week later, that speech went viral. Thousands of people, employees, whistleblowers, small business owners, reached out to thank me. They shared their own stories of being betrayed, underestimated, and discarded. Many of them said they finally found hope again. That moment meant more to me than any revenge ever could. But fate wasn't done with me yet. Months later, I received another letter, this time from a legal team representing my old company. They were facing a class action lawsuit for the very same unethical practices I had exposed years ago. They wanted Audit Shield to consult on compliance improvements, again. Only this time, they weren't asking, they were begging. I didn't respond immediately. I let that letter sit on my desk for days, staring at the company's logo at the top. The same logo that once haunted me. Then, one Friday evening, I signed the contract, but with a condition: they would have to publicly acknowledge my contribution to rebuilding their integrity program. When they agreed, the press release went out. My name was there, bold and unmistakable: ethics consultant and founder of Audit Shield, whose work exposed previous misconduct, will now lead corporate rehabilitation efforts. I sat back in my chair, a quiet smile spreading across my face. The same company that once fired me in shame was now paying me to teach them honesty. That was more than revenge. That was poetic justice carved into history. And sometimes, late at night, when the office is quiet and the city lights flicker outside my window, I think back to that one afternoon years ago, the day they audited my desk while I was at lunch. I remember the humiliation, the whispers, the fear. Then I look around at everything I've built, the people I've helped, the legacy I've created, and I whisper to myself, with a calm, certain smile, let them search my desk now. A few months after that moment, Audit Shield expanded overseas. We opened our first European branch in London, then one in Singapore. Each new office carried the same mission: protect the honest, expose the corrupt, and give power back to the people who actually keep businesses alive. We weren't just consultants anymore, we were reformers. The company I once worked for, the one that betrayed me, had become one of many clients learning from the very person they discarded. That irony never stopped being sweet. One afternoon, while attending a high-profile corporate summit in Zurich, I was approached by a gray-haired man in a sharp suit. He extended his hand and introduced himself. It was one of the former board members who had approved my termination years ago. For a brief second, I saw the discomfort behind his polished smile. "I just wanted to say," he began awkwardly, "you were right, about everything." I looked him in the eye, calm but detached. "I wasn't trying to be right," I said. "I was trying to make things right. You just didn't want to see it." He nodded quietly, then walked away, shoulders heavy with the weight I'd shed long ago. That night, as I stood on my hotel balcony overlooking the city lights, I thought about the journey. How betrayal had turned into purpose. How humiliation had evolved into strength. Every failure, every sneer, every closed-door meeting meant to silence me. It had all been fuel. Without it, I wouldn't have built Audit Shield. Without it, I wouldn't have learned that revenge isn't about getting even, it's about becoming untouchable. A year later, Audit Shield was featured in Forbes under the headline, "The Whistleblower Who Built an Empire of Integrity." The article told my story from the beginning, the desk audit, the firing, the rise. When it went live, my inbox flooded with messages from employees worldwide sharing their gratitude, their stories, their own small acts of rebellion against corporate injustice. That's when I realized, what started as a personal fight had become something bigger than me. And as for Greg? Rumor had it he'd tried starting his own consulting business but failed miserably. No one trusted him. His name had become synonymous with deceit. He moved to another city, took a minor job, and vanished from the industry. I didn't celebrate his downfall. I didn't need to. He had created his own cage. One evening, while closing up my office, I found myself drawn to an old cardboard box I kept tucked away in my bookshelf, the same one that held copies of the documents from the day of my audit. I opened it, sifting through the papers, remembering how terrified I'd been back then. I found one yellowed sticky note I'd written to myself on that day: "They can't take your integrity." I smiled. That note had been right all along. They could take my job, my title, my paycheck, but not my name, and not my truth. The building was quiet as I turned off the lights, but I could still see the city glowing outside, thousands of offices, each with its own stories of ambition, betrayal, and redemption. I knew I couldn't save everyone. But I could make sure no one like me ever faced it alone again. And that's when I understood the full circle of it all. The day they audited my desk wasn't the end, it was the beginning of a legacy. A legacy built not from anger, but from resolve. Because in the world of business, everyone chases power. But the real power? It's not in money, or titles, or revenge. It's in walking away stronger, while they crumble under the weight of their own corruption. And that's exactly what I did. I didn't just survive their audit. I turned it into my empire. 2 years later, Audit Shield was operating on 5 continents, partnering with international watchdogs and financial institutions to uncover corruption in billion-dollar corporations. What had started as one man's act of defiance had turned into a global force. We had hundreds of employees, many of them people who, like me, had once been silenced or scapegoated. We didn't just expose fraud, we taught companies how to earn back trust. One day, I was invited to a government ethics summit in Washington, D.C., to discuss corporate accountability in the digital era. As I stood backstage waiting to go on, I caught a glimpse of myself in a monitor. There I was, older, calmer, a little gray at the temples, but still carrying that same quiet fire. The host introduced me with a line that made me pause: "A man who turned personal injustice into a global mission." As I stepped onto the stage, I remembered that cold office floor where Greg and his cronies had once searched my desk, convinced they'd find something to ruin me. They had no idea that, years later, I'd be here, speaking to the world about integrity, while their names were footnotes in a cautionary tale. After my talk, an audience member, a young analyst, approached me. She told me she'd been unfairly blamed for a data breach at her firm and nearly quit the industry until she read my story. "You reminded me that truth wins," she said softly. I shook her hand and smiled. "That's why I tell it," I replied. That conversation stuck with me. It reminded me that this wasn't just about revenge, it was about legacy. The kind that outlives your pain. The kind that turns scars into blueprints for others to follow. A few months later, I received another surprise. My old company, yes, the very same one that fired me, was being acquired by an international conglomerate. The new owners wanted to perform a full compliance audit before the takeover, and they'd recommended Audit Shield as the lead firm. When my assistant told me, I laughed. It wasn't malicious, it was poetic. Fate had brought me full circle. I signed the contract without hesitation. Weeks later, I walked through those familiar glass doors once more. Everything looked different, new logo, new leadership, but I could still feel the echoes of the past in the walls. The new CEO, a polite but nervous man, greeted me personally. "We're honored to have you here," he said. "We know what this place used to be." I smiled faintly. "So do I." The audit went smoothly, and we found nothing unethical in the new operations. But I couldn't resist one small gesture before leaving. On my final day, I slipped that old sticky note, the one that said they can't take your integrity, into the drawer of the CEO's desk. No signature. No message. Just a reminder. When I stepped outside, the cool wind hit my face, and I felt it, closure. True closure. Not the kind you get from revenge, but from knowing you've outlasted the storm, and you're still standing while the world that tried to bury you has turned to dust. Years later, when Audit Shield was valued at over $1 billion and featured on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, I finally took a quiet moment to breathe. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even proud, I was at peace. Because every betrayal, every insult, every locked office door had led to this moment. And as I looked out over the skyline from my penthouse office, the city lights twinkling below, I realized something simple but powerful. They had audited my desk to find flaws. But all they found was the man who would one day audit the world. A few more years passed, and by then, Audit Shield had become more than a company, it was a movement. Universities began teaching our model in business ethics courses. Our reports were cited in court cases and legislative reforms. Whistleblowers trusted us. Corporations feared us. And every time a case ended with justice served, I felt that same quiet satisfaction deep inside me. One afternoon, I was invited to a private roundtable with some of the biggest CEOs in the country, men and women who controlled industries, economies, and narratives. I could tell some of them weren't thrilled to have me there. They smiled politely, but behind their eyes was something else, unease. Because they all knew my story. They all knew what happened when people like me were underestimated. During that meeting, one of the executives, a smug billionaire with an expensive watch and a condescending tone, said, "Integrity is good for PR, but it's not a growth strategy." The room chuckled, but I didn't. I leaned forward, locked eyes with him, and said calmly, "Neither is fraud. It's a time bomb, you just haven't heard the ticking yet." The laughter died instantly. That was the moment I realized the true power of reputation. I didn't need revenge anymore. My name carried enough weight to silence entire boardrooms. Later that evening, as I left the conference center, the journalist caught up to me. "You've built something that's reshaped corporate accountability," she said. "What drives you now?" "You've already won." I paused for a moment before answering. "It's not about winning anymore. It's about making sure no one else has to lose the way I did." That night, I walked through downtown, passing by skyscrapers filled with late-night workers, people still chasing deadlines, promotions, validation. I used to be one of them. Now, I understood something they didn't yet. The real measure of success isn't how high you climb in a company, it's what you do when the company turns its back on you. A few days later, a letter arrived at my office. It was handwritten, rare in this digital age. Inside was a short note: "You don't know me, but years ago, your story saved me. I was fired for exposing financial fraud. I almost gave up, but your interviews gave me courage. Now, I lead my own firm, built on the same principles. Thank you. I sat back in my chair, reading it again and again. That was the real reward, not the money, not the recognition, but the ripple effect. My revenge had turned into a legacy that outlived me. One evening, long after everyone else had gone home, I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office, watching the city lights reflect off the glass towers. Somewhere in those buildings were people just like I had been, overlooked, underestimated, maybe even betrayed. I wanted them to know one thing: it doesn't end there. It never does. The world will try to audit your worth, tear apart your name, and search for weaknesses. But if you stand firm in who you are, if you let your integrity be the one thing they can't touch, you'll rebuild stronger than they can ever imagine. So, when I finally turned off the lights and left the office that night, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt fulfilled. I had started with a desk audit meant to destroy me. Now, I'd built an empire that outlasted the very people who tried. And as the elevator doors closed behind me, I smiled to myself, thinking, they once searched my desk looking for evidence of failure. Instead, they uncovered the beginning of a legacy. Years later, when I finally stepped away from Audit Shield, the world had changed, and so had I. What began as one man's desperate fight for dignity had become a global symbol of truth. The firm continued to thrive under new leadership, built on the same foundation I'd laid: transparency, fairness, and unshakable ethics. I no longer needed to fight to prove myself. The work spoke louder than any revenge ever could. On my last day, I stayed late after everyone else had gone home. The office was quiet, the city lights glittering beyond the glass, just like the night I'd decided to rebuild my life from nothing. I walked through the halls slowly, taking it all in: the framed awards, the glowing screens, the quiet hum of success. Then I stopped by my desk, the same kind I'd once been accused of hiding secrets in, and placed that old sticky note, "They can't take your integrity," inside the top drawer one last time. I wasn't leaving in anger or triumph. I was leaving complete. Because everything they tried to destroy in me, the ambition, the loyalty, the integrity, had become the very tools that rebuilt my future. They fired me, humiliated me, and tried to erase me. Instead, they had written my legend. As I stepped out into the cool night air, I looked up at the skyline and smiled. The buildings, the lights, the people, they all carried stories like mine, some still in the middle of their battles. I hoped they'd remember this: being underestimated isn't the end. It's the start of something greater. Because sometimes the world will audit your worth, question your loyalty, and strip away everything you've built. But if you hold on to your integrity, truly hold it, it becomes your most powerful weapon. They thought they ended my story when they audited my desk. But all they did was give me a reason to write the next chapter. And in that chapter, I didn't just survive them, I outlived them.